Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine. Beautiful fall day, early in the fall. We got the leaves starting to turn, so I'm enjoying that. And I have three little fat black kittens outside here playing in front of my place.
Oh,
These are my little fellas that kind of wandered in here with their mommy wandered in here and she had them here.
So they have Patty home citizenship now.
They do have Patty home citizenship.
hmm
There are three little tomcats. We got rid of the other three. There were six kittens this poor cat was carrying. God love her.
Goodness, yeah.
And we found homes for three, and we didn't find homes for these three, but they are very well loved, I assure you.
Of that, I have no doubt. So I would like to say, if you are first finding us, we appreciate you finding. If you wouldn't mind letting us know how you heard about us, either in a comment on the video or through an email at paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com, which is linked down below. Links for the Facebook groups as well. If you are returning, thank you. You don't have to tell us how you found us, but if you want to send us something as well, we'd be more than happy to receive your email or your comments. Everything else, again, like I said before, is in the description. If you would click the like button, that would help us. Man, I took a week off for vacation and I'm just completely discombobulated. So that's how it works. But I think that's it now. Normally I'd ask you what we're doing this episode, but this is part 2 as a continuation from last episode.
Indeed.
So I
And
kind of know. Yeah.
yeah,
hmm
I think that there's some really cool stories that we're going to start with. In fact, we're going to start with one that is really unusual. So this takes place in 1942 in Hawaii. Now, I want to give a little background. So many people don't know that Hawaii has three sets of people who mainly populated it. So first, of course, were the Native Hawaiians, and then the Japanese populated it, and then the Americans. So there's a huge Japanese population. You'll find that there's history and folklore and all kinds of Japanese culture still very, very prevalent. And in 1942, it was very much that way. And to that end, we're going to talk about something called the kasha. The kasha is a Japanese piece of folklore. It's about this thing called fire. It means fire cart. And it talks about these beings that live among the humans under the guise of a house cat or a stray animal. They are bipedal when they are in their natural form, and they're very large, bigger than most people. And they are accompanied by flames from hell. They
Oh,
come to Earth and they try to participate with us. And what they're looking for is the ability to consume human flesh. So they are ghoul in European terms.
okay.
They only show who and what they really are when they're extremely excited and about to feed. So there's a great many stories about them appearing in funerals or at cemeteries after the family left, things like this. But this is not that story. This is a story about something completely different. It's based on newspaper accounts, for those who wonder where I got this from. And this is practicing something called kayamuki, which is kind of their form of witchcraft. You can conjure these beings, and it's believed that that's possibly what happened. Now, who believed that? Not just the families to whom it happened, but the police officers who were called on account of what went on. So let me start. On Wednesday night in the springtime in Hawaii, it was about 1:30 in the morning. Police Sergeant Mosley Cummins and Patrolman Robert Anseth were called because a Hawaiian boy who was 10 years old and his two sisters, 18 and 20, were shrieking on the sofa. Their mother was screaming onto the phone, screaming, "There's something here. You've got to help us. There's something in my house. I can't make the kids stop. They see it. They see it." Now, the 10-year-old boy was screaming that there was a monster with flames that was threatening to eat them. The girls and he supposedly saw this. The mother is crying into the phone. She's hysterical. She says, I need your help. I need your help. Her husband had abandoned her and the kids only recently, so they're kind of still in that adjustment period. The police go over expecting either a prank or somebody playing a dirty trick. So they get to the house on Kahuna Drive, and it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, and this is the mother's sister's home. So the mother of the children, her sister had come over as well, and she had gathered them up and taken them out of the house. They were really upset, and they were, saying what they had seen, and that, that this they're sure that this was real. So it sounds crazy, but it happens again a couple weeks later. But it's not the kid and his family. It's another family on this other street on a place called Wa'ali Avenue, which is exactly where the house actually sat. So the police are called, and this woman is on the phone. She's screaming her daughter saw this thing, and she's hysterical. She's like, you've got to help us. You've got to help us. It's trying to strangle my daughter. The police come, and the girl is pulling at her throat as though she's clawing at something, trying to get it off of her. Her mother's screaming. Her sister's backed up in a corner, and she's screaming, make it stop, make it stop. It's choking her. The police officer jumps out of his car. He sees, he hears the screaming. He thinks somebody really is getting murdered. Gets into the house, sees all of this, and he says, this is what he says. I'm reading an exact quote from the story. This story, and I will tell you the newspaper if you want to know. He says, and I quote, a big, strong, calloused hand that could not possibly belong to a teenage girl grabbed my arm and twisted it. I radioed for assistance and began to try to help the girl. He said he got the girl to the parking lot and her family. They got her into the car, and he said she began to scream, there's a ghost in the car, there's a ghost in the car. And the girls were hysterical. He said, I told the girl that had been choked to get into my police car, and the other two to follow us. So that's the mom and the other daughter. As soon as she gets into the police car, the motor died in the police car. He had it running, and it wouldn't start up again. He put her back into her mother's car, and the car started up on its own. This is his testimony. Then the car drove itself. Both cars drove themselves approximately 5 yards, and suddenly the door to the girl's car flew open, and the girl fell out on the road, the one that was being choked. She's again tearing at her throat. Together, the two policemen, there was another police officer who had responded, were not strong enough to pull her hands away. The Hawaiian sergeant ran to a local cafe where he grabbed Hawaiian sea salt and a glass of water, which he sprayed on everyone. Suddenly, calm was restored. And when he was interviewed about this, he said, it's something my grandma told me. I never tried it before, but she said it would send a ghost away, sea salt and water, which almost every culture has a salt ritual for binding or getting rid of ghosts. Just so those. Now, fast forward to October 31st of 1972. That was 1942. So we're now in 1972. Somebody was talking about local haunted houses for Halloween and what have you. So they get a phone call from 3 girls who are sharing a house in a neighborhood near where this supposedly happened. In fact, they would later realize it was the same house. The street names had been changed. So it actually after doing some research, figure out it was the same house. These 3 college age girls are sharing this apartment, this house now. And the girls heard strange noises like someone moving and talking. One of the girls said she felt a physical sensation of somebody resting their hand on her arm. They called the police. They were frightened because they could hear talking and could not find anybody. So the officers followed the girls. They got the girls out of the house and followed them from where they lived. The one girl got in her car, and the officer got in his car, and he drove down the avenue. Suddenly, the girl driving pulled the car up in front of a cafe, and there, according to the report, The girl sat in the middle of the, was sitting in the middle of the front seat. So all three girls are in the front seat. It's a bench
Okay.
seat.
Mm-hmm.
Something began to strangle her. However, there was nothing there. The police officer stated he pulled his car up. The other two girls were screaming and fighting as if trying to pull something off this girl. This girl was screaming, pulling at her throat. And he said, I grabbed what it felt like a big calloused hand, but there was nothing I could see. It was invisible, but it twisted my arm when it reached out for me. He ran back to the squad car and yelled for, to the mic. He wanted help, help, help. The girl and her friends were supposed to follow him to the police station, but his car refused to start. So the girl said, why don't you get in our car? You drive us. We'll get to the police station. He tried to drive the car, and the car doors flew open. Two of the girls fell out on the ground, and the car, although it was in drive, shot forward 5 feet and then shot backward several feet, hitting his car. He stated that he did not put it in reverse. Another officer arrives, and they can't help this girl either. And eventually they calm her down. She says the hand's gone. And when they started looking into it, they began to compare notes, and they found these old articles from 42
Okay.
that made it into local newspapers, and realized this was the third time at that property that something like this had occurred. There was speculation in one of the newspaper articles that this thing could have been akasha, which is a collector and consumer of dead corpses. It is a poltergeist-like being conjured by Japanese curses that tear the victim limb to limb. And then as they began to look into this, they began to ask questions about the property. A reporter found out about all this, and he's the guy who found the old maps and realized what had happened is they added a street and renamed all the streets. So every street was off by one. And that explains, and whenever you put the map back to what it originally had been,
Okay.
that is the same house for all three events. He not only found that, he found an ad from 1967 in what was called the Honolulu Advertiser for a 2-bedroom house for $155 a month. It does not give the house name, but it says, please understand this house may be haunted.
Well, full disclosure,
So he's thinking it's the exact same house because it doesn't say the address, but it's on that road. It says the name of the road, and again, it has that information in it. So what was the truth of it? I don't honestly know, but I thought that was quite an interesting story.
especially to have happened multiple times. And
Yeah, 3 different families over the course of 30 some years. So yeah, it's a fascinating story. There's actually been there's been a writer recently who has been doing a lot of research and collected a bunch of these Kasha stories. So apparently they're fairly, I don't want to say common, that's not true, but there are several more of these stories of visitations from these beings in Hawaii. And he wrote a book on it.
And would it have to be salt and water, or would salt water do it?
It has to be salt and water.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, I would think that if you bless salt water, it would do the same thing. But most of the time, it's usually dried salt and holy water or blessed water.
Oh, okay. All right. But when you say he came from
Mhm.
he got the water from a bar, I wouldn't think that you'd have a cleric or somebody in there blessing the water.
Right. So I just thought it was a fascinating story. So the next story was about, I think this is one of the most fascinating stories. It's either one of the most interesting or one of the most elaborate hoaxes that ever happened. And I'm going to say it that way right now. So we're going to go to San Francisco for this haunting. Actually, we're going to go up to a particular street called Lombard Street.
Oh, the twisty, windy. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Very famous around the world for 1000 Lombard Street. So this is a very long street, and it's got very, very twisty, mountainously tough curves and what have you. In the 1960s and 70s, Lombard Street was very well known because it was a very popular address for young people there was the hippie movement and the Hollywood movement of, people and what have you. And so this particular street was a very, very well-known street. However, and this is about a building there that was an apartment building. There was a young woman who was, her name was, I want to make sure I say it right. So bear with me because I have to look at it every time in order to say it.
Okay.
Pat Montadon. Montadon. So Pat Montadon was a young woman who basically had come from kind of tough times. She had come to Hollywood to make her fortune. She had been on a couple dating shows, things like this, and had caught somebody's eye. And from that, she had begun throwing parties, these amazing parties, like themed parties. And she would invite all these really rich people. And she was beautiful, she was young, and she was unique. So she begins to get a reputation for these amazing flamboyant parties she throws. And she rents an apartment on Lombard Street in this great big building. Now, she actually makes it into like local newspapers and national covers of magazines as a socialite, and she basically kind of bluffed her way into it.
Okay.
And she gets a job working at a TV station and doing a radio show all about romance and what have you. And she becomes very, very popular. Like she was getting hundreds of letters every day. She was making a lot of money. So she could afford to live in a fancy place and continue this process. So we're going to fast forward to 1975. She's very well established, has this job. Everything's going great. She decides to do a tarot reading party for Halloween. So she invites all these illustrious figures and a bunch of her friends. Like her parties would be like 300 people. It was huge. And she was friends with people like Anton LaVey, who wrote the Satanic Bible. Like she knew everybody in Hollywood. And so she decides, she reaches out some places and she gets these names of this guy who's a tarot reader who's going to come and participate in her party. And he's late. So she has all these people here and the tarot reader doesn't show up. So eventually he does wander in and he looks like he came out of central casting. He's got a long, dark green cape, velvet cape, and a turban with feathers and, the whole 9 yards. And he's got a retinue of onlookers who like, oh, Swami so-and-so, kind of a deal. And so he's over the top, but she's just grateful he's there because she has all these people who want to get their fortunes read. And some of them are very, very well healed. So she leads this guy to this table and she's like, here, go ahead and sit down and start. And I'll be back. And he's like, I need a drink. And she's like, do you think it's wise to be drinking while you're doing this? And he's like, I need an alcoholic beverage. It makes the spirits talk to me better. So she goes off to get him a drink and gets waylaid by a bunch of people and forgets to get him a drink. And about half an hour to 45 minutes go by and she comes back and he looks at her and he goes, where's my drink? She's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot it. I'll go get it now. And he stands up and he's very, again, central casting. He's very flamboyant and he's like, I refuse to work under these conditions. I curse you. And he lays this big heavy curse on her about how she and her family and friends and all of the things she ever does will all, fall apart, and she will rue the day she ever crossed him. And he and his little retinue of people go hoofing out of the place, right? And that's that. 20 minutes later, there's a fire in the hallway and the whole party has to be shut down. She thinks it's either A, a coincidence, or B, one of his people set a fire to be a sign. No big deal, right? Everybody made it out okay. The house didn't burn down. Nothing happened, blah, blah, blah. About a couple months later, these people move in above her. And at first she thinks they're just, normal people. It's a man and his wife, and they've got a couple Basenji dogs and what have you. And I believe there was a child involved as well. But it just becomes insane. Over the course of about a 1.5 year period, these people become like the neighbors from hell. Her house gets broken into on multiple occasions. She hears voices in the house while she's She hears people walking outside her door as if they're trying her doorknob. There's a back set of stairs so that there's an entrance and exit on both ends of this big apartment, and people are out there. There's uh, all kinds of craziness. She thinks it's the neighbors. And then one night, all hell breaks loose. She's in her bedroom. She's laying in bed, and she hears this steady it sounds like something dripping on the bed. And she hears voices out in the hallway. She hears noises and she hears talking in the room, but she can't quite make out the words, that kind of a deal. She turns the light on, and red stuff is leaking out of the ceiling and dripping on her white bedspread. Well, she doesn't know what to do at this point, so she calls the police. And she's like, I don't know what's going on up there, but what I do know is I've called the landlord multiple times. Nobody comes. Something's wrong. You need to check it out. So they go upstairs. Now, according to her, Pat tells, and she writes a book called The Intruders about this series of events, okay? And eventually, years later, and she says that the police go up, that they eventually come back down, and they say to her, why don't you come upstairs with us? I'll show you what's going on. And somebody had taken all this elaborate, expensive furniture that these people had brought with them, piled it on the balcony, and set it on fire.
Oh.
They had somehow stuffed thank goodness it didn't catch like it could have, like it smoldered and what have you, but it didn't like erupt the whole building into flames. That they had somehow plugged the toilets, the sinks, everything. And what was dripping was a viscous liquid out of the commode, and it was leaking down onto her bed.
Yuck.
Yes. So over time, she keeps this apartment. She ends up getting married. She actually marries Melvin Belli, the attorney, only for 36 days, and then divorces him.
Boy.
And then, and like I said, she was into everything. She was friends with LaVey, and she had people that would write to her for love potions and do this, that, and the other. And she was all into it, right? It was the 70s, and she got wilder and wilder as the years went by. But in her personal life, she was a completely different person. So she ends up meeting a man and marrying him. And her friend and a person who had worked for her for a while, I had to have a place to stay. And she knew that over the course of time, Pat had decided that this house was she was being haunted by the curse of this crazy guy that had been there to do the tarot readings. And there have been all kinds of crazy incidents, such as, like I said, the footsteps, the voices knocking in the wall on an inside wall where you shouldn't have been able to get anybody in there. So like it's a wall that backs up on her living room, and she could hear somebody on the other side of the wall walking and knocking on the door or on the wall. When she would come over to the doorway and look through, there'd be nobody there, and it would stop. And then she would go back to the bedroom and sit down on the bed and wait, and it would start again. Just crazy stuff. And I mean, in her personal life, she had a lot of good luck. I won't say she didn't. She wrote a couple books. She became very famous. She interviewed Hugh Hefner and all these really famous people. She was making quite a name for herself. She gets married, she moves out, she decides to keep the apartment, and then her friend says she needs a place for her and her son to stay for a little while. Can we stay at the apartment? And she says, aren't you afraid? She said, no, I don't. I never believed that bullcrap. It's a nice apartment. It's sitting empty. Why not? She's like, all right, if you're sure. And she said when she took her friend over and gave her the keys, the place was very, very cold and damp and just eerie. She said, are you really sure? We could get you a hotel somewhere. She's like, no, there's no reason. We'll be fine. So the first night they're there, the woman later tells the story that she was uncomfortable, and she kind of blamed Pat for it because she kind of got her psyched up. And the long and the short of it is she lived in the house in this apartment for like 4 days. And her son, who was a young teenager, came home from school on the fourth day and found that she had been murdered.
Oh.
Nobody to this day knows how, know why, who, whatever. It's never been solved. So she kept the apartment for quite a while. Mostly, I think at one point, it was because she got afraid of it and afraid that other people would get hurt there. She could afford
Mm.
to, keep the apartment because she was very well to do. And she always told her husband and everybody it was her office space, but she didn't write there. She didn't do anything there. She just left stuff there in storage. So she kept the apartment for quite a long time. Other people went there, were injured, and that had gone there to stay. There were other instances where she would get, she could actually, from her apartment she and her husband lived in, she could see that apartment and she could see lights on in it when there was nobody staying there, figures walking through it. On multiple occasions early on, she called the police, and when they would get there with and meet her, there would never be anybody there. The windows and doors would be opened. She would lock them all, and the police would leave, and later on in the night, she would see it again. I just thought this was a fascinating story. She would eventually hire someone to break the curse. And then she sold the apartment or released it to somebody else. It's a really crazy story, isn't it?
Yeah, all because she didn't get the dude his drink.
If the story's true. Now, there has been a lady who does a podcast from England who recently, she's an expert on like doing background research. And she says she read the book, which is what got her interested in the case in the first place. And she went through and she said, look, if you look at the timelines of this woman's life, and everything she did was in the society pages, it was most likely not 1967, but 1963, whenever this whole event happened. And nothing seems to have happened for a long time. The rest of the stuff only picks up 3 years later. She's like, why there's that discrepancy, I don't know, but it makes me leery.
At least casts a reasonable doubt.
It does. So I want to say the story
Mhm.
that way, that there's some reasonable doubt that maybe she embellished, maybe just a series of things happened and she decided to wrap them up with that and write this book, which sold really well for quite a while. I don't know. But on the other hand, perhaps it's true. And she chose to change the time frame to make it like happen more quickly. So it was more continuity to the story. As a writer, I can see where, that's a possibility.
But normally in nonfiction doesn't have too much poetic license.
Right.
Yeah.
Usually it's, like normally I would say 3 years went by and nothing happened. She was lulled into a false sense of security. And then suddenly the curse seemed to kick in. And then I would tell the story. That's how me personally would handle it, but I'm not her. So our next one is we're going to be traveling to an old hotel. So this is a little town called Tonopah, Nevada. It is a hotel called the Mitzvah Hotel. And the story behind the little town is that, according to the story, in 1900 there was a prospector whose donkey ran off one night. There was a lot of mining going on in this area. And when he found it the next day, he picked up a rock to throw it at the donkey for wandering off, and instead he found silver ore. Thus began what became one of the hugest silver ore deposits in Nevada's history and would establish the town of Tonopah. So after the town is built, they have to have, it becomes very, very popular. Obviously there's a lot of people that are there just to try their luck for the silver. They're living in tents and what have you, but very well-to-do people wanted to also try their luck. You saw that up in Alaska with the gold rush as well, like, Roosevelts and stuff like that who wanted to go up and pan for gold a little bit, but they did also want to have a little comfort. So they would stay in these big hotels. So these hotels kind of started shooting up. And what else goes with hotels and minors? Alcohol and prostitutes. So in 1907, the Mitzvah Hotel was opened. It was 5 stories high. It was the largest building in Nevada until 1927. And along with it, there was prostitutes and alcohol. So the miners like hung out there. There are lots of famous names from senators to other politicians, and there's a story about a Nevada senator named Key Pittman who died near an election day. And Pittman's corpse was left on ice in the Mitzvah Hotel bathroom until the election was over. They don't say if he's Republican or Democrat, because the party was afraid that he would lose the vote if people knew he was dead, which I would like to point out is not necessarily so, because there was a dude in Pennsylvania, was it the last election or the election before, who died like 3 months before the election, and he still won the election in his town. I don't know if you remember that story or not.
I don't remember the name, but I vaguely remember that story. Yeah.
And so I don't think they needed to keep him on ice in the bathroom, but apparently they did. So by 1999, the heyday of the Mitzvah Hotel was gone. And, there are all the stories of the prostitutes and all this good stuff. And the hotel had fallen on really hard times. It was abandoned. And then a man came along in 2011 named Fred Klein. He and his wife walked through the hotel, took a look at it, and they were like, you can still see the bones of what a beautiful hotel it had once been. And they decided to buy the hotel and redo it. They put an awful lot of time, sweat, and money in. And during the period of time while they were renovating, they came across a lot of stories and ghost stories and historical pieces as well. One of the stories that they would hear from a lot of the locals was the Lady in Red. So there was a set of rooms up at the very top of the hotel that were kind of like for the very well-to-do. And supposedly there was a lady in red who lived on the 5th floor, and she was murdered. She had been either a prostitute or she was cheating on her fiance. Either way, she was killed in that penthouse apartment. And supposedly she haunts that section. Now, to make matters a little confusing, of course, when they redid the hotel, they renumbered it. And they made some of the very, very large rooms into smaller rooms. So like it would be a large room and it would be a 3-room suite now.
Okay.
Okay. So the rooms are most likely from 502 and through 504, 502, 503, 504. And they say that they see her. People see her when they rent that suite. Some will say that they hear her whispering in their ear as they are laying in bed, mostly men. People will talk about a woman in red, in a red gown, seen in the hall where she walks into a wall. Other people will talk about coming in and finding their luggage rummaged through, or a woman in a red dress rummaging through their luggage. And when they yell, she disappears. And she's always looks like she's in like early 1900s gown. Now, here's the interesting thing. People have found pearls in strange places in those 3 rooms. Supposedly, when she died, her pearl necklace was ripped, and pearls were found throughout the room. The room's obviously been redone multiple times since then, but every so often somebody will find a pearl, a single pearl, in the tub, on the counter. They'll step on it on the floor. Nobody can explain why they're there. They'll find them on nightstands. I mean, that's an interesting thing. They said that they always associate it with, the woman in red, because it's in that area. Also, on the 3rd floor, there are children seen. There's no specific story, excuse me, about where the children came from, but they have actually recorded the voices of children laughing and playing and giggling on that floor. Now, this hotel has an old elevator. This elevator does not have doors that randomly open and close on their own. You have to go in and hit a button and manipulate it like you used to elevators. This elevator will go up and down all night long, stopping at different spots at different times, and nobody's ever on it, or at least nobody they see. Down in the basement, there are supposedly the spirits of 2 miners who were killed during a robbery. They had been at the hotel drinking. They had just hit a strike. They had a lot of silver on them. it had been suggested they might want to put it in the vault,
Okay.
and they didn't. And there's also stories that possibly somebody tried to tunnel through the basement wall to get to the vault to break in, and somebody shot them when they came out of the wall on the other side. So it has a lot of ghost stories. And during Ghost Adventures, when it was on, this was one of the hotels that they did, and they actually captured the voices of the children playing and laughing. I just thought it was, and I have to tell you, I've looked at all the photographs of it and stuff, the way they've redone it. It looks like you walked in 1900. It's really beautiful. And they do have a suite called the Lady in Red Suite, and it is absolutely gorgeous with, you know, cascading covers of red satin coming down around the bed. And it's just an amazing thing to look at. So if you ever get a chance and you're out in that direction, I would highly recommend looking into the place. It just looks amazing to me.
Won't be for a while, but yeah, I'll keep in mind though.
I don't know. My oldest son, he used to be a truck driver, and he said that the deserts of Arizona and Nevada are the most beautiful places he's ever been. He would like to someday retire there. So,
Mhm.
there's a lot of people who do that.
You wouldn't get 4 seasons, I'll tell you that much.
No, I suspect not. So, our last story for this particular episode is going to come from a place called Fripp Island. Now, this is in South Carolina, and it's a gorgeous. If you can imagine, this island is sitting there. It looks haunted. It just does. There's
Okay.
the Spanish moss coming down out of the trees and old abandoned buildings. There's a place called the um, Beaufort Mansion. It was abandoned, and you can see the bones of it. It's just with the moss dripping over it and the whole 9 yards. It's just really gorgeous.
That
There's
name's
this
familiar. Yeah.
Beaufort,
Hmm.
Beaufort Mansion.
Hmm.
Um, and then coming into it, there's this, you go down this road that's lined on both sides with these trees. It's almost like going through a tunnel of trees. And it's called, there's a ghost that supposedly haunts there. It's called the Land's End Light. And it supposedly is seen there, seen in the distance. And I just have to, again say it looks haunted. Everything about it. So the place was obviously a beautiful mansion, and was abandoned many, many years ago. There's so many stories about how this light came to be. So we're going to talk a few of them. So some of them claim it was a Confederate soldier who was on patrol along this road in 1861, and they were using the building as a hospital at that time. So he's guarding the hospital when a Union soldiers found him, and one of them snuck up behind him and cut his head off, like literally whacked him with a sword and cut his
Wow.
head off.
Mm.
Now he goes up and down the road, carrying his lantern like he had that night. Others talk about there were men from the 116th and a local unit of African Americans who had purchased illegal whiskey. There was a bad brawl and a gunfight, and a private by the name of Frank Quigley was killed. Supposedly, he has been seen wandering along carrying his lantern, and that he's hunting for his family who had actually been on that island. And he had hoped when he got there that he could find them because he had been separated from them by them being sold. So he wanted to go find them, and then he dies and he doesn't get to. Another story is that it's runaway slaves, and one of them were caught and was hung on one of those beautiful oak trees going down that avenue. And there's a story from the 1940s that there was a car accident on that avenue, and that, this is what you see as a single headlight of that car coming down the road. There's just so many such stories. However, I mean, just you could say, okay, that sounds like it's all kind of just folklore, but every year there are people who see it. In fact, at one point, it was like a popular spot, like the Brown Mountain Lights and all this, where people would like go out there and sit and wait for it.
Okay.
There's a place called the Chapel of Ease down at the end of the avenue where the hanging tree and all of this is at, and people used to go down there all the time. But what I thought was really interesting is one of the authors I used to read growing up was a lady by the name of Nancy Roberts. She's a paranormal author. She went there. She wrote a lot of books about the Carolinas, particularly South Carolina. And she did some research. She found that there were 2 auto accidents where people had been injured or killed while trying to catch the lights, and that a sheriff's deputy told her that they used to have to patrol over 100 cars a night coming down there. Now, one night she's out there just kind of sucking in the ambiance, and the whole 9 yards. She's all by herself, and she catches the lights on film. Just one light dancing around, bobbing along. And she has shown it to many people over the years. It's been on TV shows, all kinds of stuff. So I just thought it was a really interesting story. Then the Fripp Vault, which is the Fripp family vault, which is also on the island, has also been known to be haunted. There's supposedly stories of it, somebody being bricked up alive inside that vault. A vault, for those who don't know, is kind of like a mausoleum. It's an above ground place where you place the caskets of your dead. So the idea that somebody was sealed alive inside that mausoleum, that vault, is just, it's terrifying. And they said that you can go in there into this vault. It's abandoned now, and you'll see, you can take the bricks that are neatly stacked up in the corner and strewn them all over the floor. If you go back the next day, they'll be packed up in the corner again, as if somebody's been trying to neaten it up and try to find their way out. Other people talk about hearing sounds like screams or cries or somebody sobbing. There's footsteps that follow people through the area. There's just a ton of those types of stories, and I just thought it was a really interesting place. The ambiance, the amount of history that took place here, the amount of sightings, even people who only go there for the history and have no idea that it's got a paranormal past, they're also reporting all kinds of stories, from footfalls of a phantom that they don't see behind them, somebody touching their arm gently, to somebody sobbing softly in the distance. When you go to find them, there's nobody there, and the crying stops. And heaven only knows what happened to get somebody walled up alive in that vault. So with that, that is my last story for tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed these unusual stories of haunted houses and buildings and places. The entire island, if you get a chance to look into Fripp Island, it is completely filled with ghost stories from end to end. So with that, I'll say good night.
And I made sure I'd be quiet because you got the last word.
I knew that you were going to do that to me.